A man walked into his doctor's office and said he needed to stop watching the news. Not because it upset him, because he'd already seen it. All of it. Every headline, every segment, every interview. He'd seen it before, he was sure of it, and it was starting to unravel him. He stopped visiting friends because the second he walked into a room, the conversation already felt like something he was replaying, not living. He even stopped going to his own doctor's appointments for a while because sitting in that chair describing his symptoms felt like a rerun of a scene he'd sat through 100 times already. He wasn't lying, and he wasn't psychotic. Brain scans came back clean. He knew intellectually that none of this had actually happened before, and yet the feeling never let up. Researchers who studied his case gave it a name that sounds almost too on the nose: chronic déjà vu. For most people, déjà vu lasts a few seconds and vanishes, a strange little hiccup you shrug off on the walk to your car. For him, it never turned off. That's the extreme version, but almost everyone gets a small taste of it. You walk into a room you've never been in, or you're mid-sentence in a conversation, and something floods in. This has happened before. Not maybe. Not probably. It happened exactly like this, and you were standing right here when it did. And then, half a second later, the other half of your brain taps you on the shoulder and says, "No, it didn't. You know it didn't. You've never met this person, never stood in this kitchen, never had this conversation," and somehow both of those feelings are fully true at the same time. That collision, the total certainty of familiarity slamming into the total certainty that it's impossible, is the entire experience. It's the only moment in ordinary life where your own memory contradicts itself in real time, and you get to watch it happen. For over 100 years, that contradiction has driven scientists a little bit crazy because every clean explanation for it turns out to have a hole in it. Here's the first one people usually reach for, and it's the oldest theory in the book: past life memory, or some kind of psychic flash forward. You feel like you've lived this moment because, in some sense, you have, in a dream, in a premonition, in a life before this one. It's a satisfying story. It's also completely untestable, which is exactly the problem. A theory that can absorb any result and still claim to be right isn't a theory. It's a mood, and moods don't hold up when you actually try to study something in a lab. So researchers dropped the mysticism and went looking for a mechanical explanation instead. The next stop was the idea of a delay, that your brain processes a scene through two channels, and one lags behind the other by a fraction of a second. The second, slightly delayed signal arrives and gets mistakenly filed as a memory of the first, so the present moment gets stamped past before it's even finished happening. It's elegant. It's also never been demonstrated. Nobody has found the delay, nobody has found the two channels. It's the kind of explanation that sounds airtight in a conversation and evaporates the moment somebody asks you to point to the mechanism. Now here's where it should start to feel personal, because your brain is about to do exactly what everyone's brain does at this point in the story. You're thinking, fine, but I know what my déjà vu feels like. I know it's not a memory. I can just tell. That confidence, that quiet, private certainty that you can trust your own sense of what's a real memory and what isn't, is precisely the thing under investigation here. The tool you're using to evaluate your déjà vu is your memory system. The thing being tested is your memory system. You cannot use the ruler to measure whether the ruler is bent. So scientists went looking for a better approach. Instead of asking people what déjà vu feels like from the inside, could they build it from the outside, on purpose, in a lab? A researcher named Anne Cleary figured out how. She used virtual reality to construct scenes, living rooms, gardens, hallways, that shared the same underlying spatial layout as scenes people had seen earlier, without repeating a single object or color. A garden with a fountain in the northeast corner and a bench in the southwest, then later, in a completely different-looking scene, a shed in the northeast corner and a fence in the southwest. Same skeleton. Different skin. And over, people walked into the second scene and reported the unmistakable sense that they'd been there before. Even though, when asked directly, they couldn't recall the earlier scene it was modeled on. The feeling of familiarity showed up. The actual memory never did. This is the theory with the most support behind it. Your brain has run into this layout, or something close to it, before, not the wallpaper, not the furniture, but the underlying structure. And some part of your memory system recognizes the shape of it, even while the part that would let you consciously say, "Oh, this reminds me of that other place," stays dark. You get the feeling with none of the content. A memory that raises its hand, but never actually answers the question. That's a real mechanism, tested and replicated, and it should feel like the answer, except it doesn't fully close the case because it doesn't explain the other half of the experience. The part where you don't just feel familiarity, you feel certainty that you knew what was going to happen next. People report predicting the next sentence in a conversation or sensing which way a hallway turns before they turn it. Cleary's studies found that too. Something like a third of people, mid-déjà vu, report a strong sense of being able to predict what comes next. And then, when tested, they can't actually do it any better than chance. The prediction feeling is every bit as real and every bit as empty as the familiarity feeling. Two ghost signals firing at once, both insisting they're carrying real information, both coming up empty when you ask them to prove it. So if you were hoping for a tidy mechanical explanation you could hand to a friend at dinner and call it settled, here's the uncomfortable part. There isn't one yet. Not fully. What there is instead is a genuine turn in how researchers think about the whole phenomenon. And it flips the entire premise of the question. For decades, the working assumption was that déjà vu is a malfunction, a memory system throwing a false alarm, mistakenly tagging a new experience as an old one. But a neuroscientist named Akira O'Connor ran a different kind of study. He used a technique for artificially inducing false memory sensations in the lab, then scanned people's brains while it happened. And the regions that lit up weren't the memory centers you'd expect if the brain were genuinely, mistakenly retrieving a false memory. Instead, the activity showed up in the frontal areas associated with decision-making and conflict resolution, the parts of your brain that check your other systems for errors. That pattern looks less like a memory center getting confused and firing off a false positive, and more like a completely different system catching the confusion and stepping in to correct it. Not the glitch, the fix. Under that reading, déjà vu isn't your memory failing. It's the opposite. Some part of your brain noticed a false signal of familiarity trying to sneak past. And caught it. Flagged it. And shut it down before you actually believed you'd lived this moment before. The eerie feeling you notice isn't the malfunction announcing itself. It's the tail end of a fact check you never saw happen. The one brief moment where the correction leaks into conscious awareness before disappearing again. And this is where the pattern from every other memory quirk shows back up, because it always shows up in the same shape. Younger people get déjà vu constantly, and it drops off sharply as people get older. If déjà vu were a glitch, an error, a sign that memory circuitry is degrading, you'd expect the opposite. More errors as the system ages and wears down, the way most cognitive slips increase with age. Instead, it's the young, healthy, fast-checking systems that produce it most, and it's precisely in certain forms of dementia and in epilepsy, where the checking system itself is damaged, that déjà vu either disappears or, in the case of some seizures, floods in uncontrolled and unfiltered because nothing is catching it anymore. The people whose error correction system is compromised are the ones who lose the ability to have ordinary déjà vu at all, or who have it constantly and inescapably the way that man in his doctor's office did. The feeling isn't a sign the system is breaking. It's a sign the system is checking its own work, and for most of us, most of the time, catching itself successfully. So the thing you've spent your whole life quietly wondering, is something wrong with me? Is my memory playing tricks? Is there a wire loose somewhere? Turns out to run almost exactly backwards. The wave of déjà vu you feel walking into a room isn't proof your memory misfired. It's proof that somewhere behind the scenes, a system built specifically to catch memory misfiring did its job, and you got to feel the tail end of it working in real time. The uneasy, uncanny 2 seconds are the receipt for a background process you normally never see at all. Which means the next time it happens, the room tilts slightly. The sentence you're about to hear feels already heard. The whole scene hums with a familiarity that has no source. You don't have to reach for past lives or glitching simulations or a bug in your brain. You can just notice it, let it pass, and recognize it for what the evidence increasingly suggests it actually is. Not a malfunction announcing itself, but a quiet, competent little safeguard, quietly checking your grip on reality, and quietly confirming that it still holds. That flicker of uncertainty isn't the crack in the system. It's the sound of the system holding.